All right, welcome back everyone to CHRTC 309, which is Sociology of Youth and Religion. My head is back in a circle somehow. I still don't really know how that happened. However, today, in this lecture, whenever you look at this, I guess it's not today. It could be today. It could be in 2 months from now. Who knows? In this lecture, we are going to talk about Neo Secularization, right? Now, Neo Secularization is basically an attempt to say, okay. We agree that the inherited model, that didn't really happen. We're not entirely sold on kind of the neo, the religion as alien, late secularization model. Not entirely there. But we also don't think no secularization has happened because we clearly live in a world that's different from the beginning of the 20th century, the 19th century, the 18th century, and the centuries that came before. Clearly something has changed. And so neo-secularization is an attempt to say, okay, secularization might not mean that religion disappears, but that religion plays a very different role in society. So this is basically what a bunch of scholars, the one I've got kind of listed here is Mark Chavez, but I think the bulk of sociology of religion scholars today are basically in this camp. And I mean, I've got Neo on here, from the Matrix, because I didn't know what else to put, because how do you find a picture for neo-secularization? So I just put Neo. Hopefully you know what the Matrix is. It's now kind of an old movie. But neo-secularization, right, is this attempt to kind of figure out, all right, something's clearly changed. What does that look like? And so the argument, as I'll say in a minute, kind of hinges on religious authority. And it has, I think, a good pedigree in some of the classical kind of sociologists, not Marx, Durkheim, Weber, but some of the people who came just after them, Bella and Parsons in particular, who looked at it and said, well, really what we're seeing is religious change and religious transformation, not so much the end of religion. Okay, so let's dive into neo-secularization. So when we talk about secularization theory, there are a few things that even the big critics like Stark will basically agree to. And so basically there are social changes associated with modernity that alter religion, right? This is undeniable. It's inarguable, right? Religion is not the same today, and it is not in the same social place as it was in the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, or even the Enlightenment, right? Things have changed, and modernity has, and the changes that of society that come with it have impacted religion. And how could it be different, right? It has to be true. Everybody kind of agrees religious authority is no longer dominant in all spheres of public life, right? The church is in a much smaller place than it was in the past. And again, societies change, reorganize. This is inarguable. Even Stark is arguing with this. But is modernity synonymous with religious decline? Or does religion just change its character? This is a little bit less clear because, if modernity was toxic to religion, obviously religion would have faded away entirely. So obviously modernity isn't, because you've had the rise in modernity of all sorts, proliferations of religious life. The Mormons have come into existence in modernity, and they're, on the cusp of really being an important global religion. Pentecostalism, which is a sect of Christianity, basically that starts in 1900 on Azusa Street in Los Angeles, has now, basically blown up to become the second largest Christian denomination in the world after Roman Catholicism, with somewhere between 600 and 800 million adherents. It is a huge kind of transformation of the religious landscape. We'll talk about Pentecostalism a little bit later in the course. So clearly modernity is not toxic to religion. Religions can thrive and expand in modernity, right? It's not necessarily the case that modernity, rationalism, science destroys religion. And I think anyone who's saying that that is the case is selling you something and underplaying certain facts. Now, that isn't to say that religions always thrive and do great in modernity, but at least, if Rodney Stark was right in the arguments we saw in kind of his thinking, well, maybe the past wasn't all that friendly to religion either. Okay, the scope of religion is obviously different, and we'll have to kind of figure out what that means. All right, so when we look at kind of some alternate kind of ways of thinking about secularization, I think some of the more interesting kind of articulations of this come from Talcott Parsons and Robert Bella. So Parsons and Bella, so Bella's Parsons' student. Parsons basically is a figure who went over to Germany, kind of beginning of the 20th century, went over to Germany, picked up sociology as a discipline and sort of brought it back to the United States. So he's a very influential figure in kind of American sociology, right? Um, and the way that Parsons and Bella sort of articulate what secularization is basically they suggest that it's not the end of religion in the sort of Marx, Weber, Durkheim, Freud, Berger sort of articulation. Now they're a little earlier than Berger, but that's not important. So what they think is, right, as society becomes more complex, religion's place in it changes and evolves, and it sort of makes sense. So religion, they think goes out of the center of the public sphere, becomes more of a private matter. It's not a negative change, right? It's just a thing that happens as societies change. And basically, again, and here you can think of, and again, Luckman's a little later than Parsons and Bella, but you can hear, I think, Luckman articulating what Parsons and Bella are kind of talking about, right? Instead of people being indoctrinated, and again, that's their word, not mine. I have it on the slide. I'm not saying religion is indoctrination, because please don't write to my boss and get me fired. It's their word. Instead of people being indoctrinated, inherently, and again, think of the definition of modernity I gave from Harwas, right? Where people can choose their own story. Instead of being indoctrinated by your family, the community you were born into, people choose their own beliefs. Now, Parsons and Bella, and I think there's a strong case to be made for this, will say that chosen beliefs are probably more important to the individual than inherited beliefs, right? Someone who makes the beliefs their own will likely be more passionate about those beliefs than someone who's like, oh yeah, my parents taught me to go to church and take communion. I don't really know why. I don't know what voice I was doing there. It's terrible. But someone who's inherited it probably doesn't, and hasn't ever kind of appropriated it, probably doesn't care that much. And I think that's important. And the last thing that they kind of say that's interesting, at least on this slide, is that in the West, right, Christianity and Christian ideas will continue to have influence, even though organized Christianity will be less important. And here there's a bit of an argument that, almost a Nietzschean argument that, the shadow of Christianity, the sort of moral universe that Christianity imposed, and you can see this in David Hart's argument as well, will continue to have influence, right? Even though organized Christianity is probably not going to be at the core, and you're probably not going to tune in every time the Bishop of Edmonton speaks, right? Or even the Pope, you're not really going to care what he has to say, but that at the core, those Christian ideas will continue to hold sway. Okay, and what Parsons and Bella would say, if you define secularism as a process in which religion, falls in importance, they don't actually think that's happening. What they think is basically happening is it's just transforming, right? It still shapes people's worldview. It still shapes people's social behavior. All of those things are continuing to happen. But they think that it's changing, right? Its role in society is changing, but its religion is not dissolving. And here, this is a powerful kind of rebuke against a full secularization inherited kind of idea. Instead of saying like it's just going to dissolve and disappear, it progresses, right? It transforms with society. Modernization will change religion at the end of the day, right? It has to. But that's a progress and a change rather than a dissolution of religion. And I think that makes a lot of sense. So the piece that's signed for kind of this section from Mark Chavez, the secularization as a reduction of religious authority, I think has a lot of interesting stuff to say. And basically, you can sort of look according to Chavez, and it's not in those, he doesn't use this terminology in the piece I gave you. He develops this kind of terminology afterwards. So the terminology you see in the reading I gave you is a little bit different, but you can see the outline of these things in there. But basically, you can say secularization can occur at the micro individual level, the meso level of institutions, and the macro societal level. So basically what Chavez will argue, both in this piece and other places, is that in the US and in a lot of Western societies, there seems to be secularization taking place at the macro level, but not as much at the micro level. There's less religious authority, right? Religious authority, if you measure secularization by religious authority, it's clear that secularization is going on, right? That basically churches and other religious institutions have less power to kind of use the transcendent to get behaviors they want out of people, whether that's behaving a certain way or giving money or whatever it happens to be, right? That is obvious. But I think this is a nice insight from Chavez that I think is basically right. There's less religious authority if you conceive of religious authority as the power to get people to do what you want using sort of transcendent power, or your access to that transcendent power as, or religious power, God talk, as he puts it. If you define it that way, then yes, things are changing. Okay, that's important. And we'll talk about the kind of 3 levels of this that Chavez thinks are going on. Wallace and Bruce, basically, and Steve Bruce, sometimes he's in kind of either the pure secularization or the Neo Secularization frame. I tend to think he falls more in the pure secularization frame, but here, he contributed with Wallace in talking about institutional differentiation. Yeah, and basically, for most people now, there's institutional differentiation. Religion has influence now only in its own sphere, right? And then indirect effects on business, politics, leisure, education, government. All of these things are now only indirectly influenced by religion. Religious institutions have much more limited influence, right? Their God talk can only motivate people to a certain extent. And actually, I mean, again, if you want to talk about perhaps evangelicals, you might start to see political institutions having more influence on religious institutions. So, the direction in some cases might actually reverse. And there's been an interesting kind of case made that, if evangelicals wanted, being that they're Donald Trump's most reliable kind of voting bloc, that they might have, potentially changed Donald Trump's whole policy, but that Donald Trump affected evangelicals more than evangelicals affected Donald Trump, which I think is actually kind of an interesting argument, suggesting that, the religious institutions have a clear limit on their ability to motivate. All right, so on the macro level of secularization, this is something that's kind of familiar and it shares in a sense with the inherited model. Basically, macro level secularization will say that religion, declines in the social or the public sphere, right? Its intimate links to other social institutions kind of break down, and it ceases to control institutions that it once controlled. So religion no longer runs schools, except in kind of some very isolated cases. But if you look at public education broadly in the West, it's more isolated cases than it is the norm. Medical care, for the most part, is no longer under religious control. And even when you have religious hospitals, they often are running state policies. Social welfare, in most developed countries, has ceased to be the purview of religion altogether, with religion providing kind of assistance at the fringes, but the core of the social welfare system being secular. And religious institutions now, are one institution among many, right? They don't control everything. Just put it that way, rather than listing a bunch of institutions, right? They are just one among the state and media and commerce and all of these things. When neo-secularization theorists talk about meso-level secularization, or like in the middle, you get the same as like mezzanine, like that middle floor that some buildings have. Meso-level secularization, so in the middle between macro and micro, what he says is that even within some religious or para-religious institutions, you get a degree of secularization. So Chavez refers to this as internal secularization within religious organizations. So that basically they start to act and function along the same lines as secular institutions would. The example that's given here, and I think is an interesting one, is secularization of institutions of higher learning that at least started out with denominational affiliation. So places like Harvard, which was Calvinist, Yale, which was Congregationalist, Princeton, which was Presbyterian, Duke, which was Methodist, and say Notre Dame, which was Roman Catholic. All of these, have their founding by religious communities, but broadly today function more or less as secular institutions. And I mean, if you want a kind of contemporary example of this, in 2019, students at University of Notre Dame, so this is an arguably Catholic university, it's still run fundamentally by an order of Catholic priests, received a petition from students to basically block pornography on the university's Wi-Fi, which the board of Notre Dame and the president of Notre Dame, who's a Catholic priest, said no. Okay, so basically, they don't make curriculum decisions based on theological concerns, and they broadly don't make either hiring or even policy decisions based on theological concerns, which the example that I just cited, pornography at Notre Dame, is a pretty clear indicator of. Now, most of these schools, right, Harvard, Yale, and Princeton, and Duke, all have divinity schools, basically training places for pastors or priests. But broadly speaking, these are kind of, secondary to their mission. You do have now lots of hospitals as well, that had religious foundings, but now are basically administrative in their management procedures, right? They follow kind of secular norms. For the most part, say the Catholic hospitals in Alberta follow sort of secular norms outside of a couple of kind of touchy issues. Religious kind of hospitals in the US are basically the same. So I have a little clip here from The Simpsons. It's extremely snarky, and I mean no offense by it, but it's funny and I love The Simpsons. But here, just keep in mind what I'm trying to get at here is, I'm making a joke about how a place like Yale would make its decisions. Does it make it on broadly Christian grounds, like its Congregationalist roots still driving what goes on at Yale, or is it something else?
It's always wonderful when a successful
and childless
alumnus returns.
It's delightful how you take turns sniffing after my money.
Now here's a group that was established in 1909.
I hate modern music.
To the tables down at Maurice, to the place where Louis dwells, to the dear old temple bar we love so well.
The Whiffenpoofs. I'll buy you a new library if you have them killed.
So many have tried to kill them.
But other smug jackasses in white gloves would just take their place.
We can't be stopped.
Well, I am here to offer you money. I'd like to endow a Department of Nuclear Plant Management.
Wonderful. Of course, we can't do nuclear.
Our students are highly entitled wusses.
You'd be creating a space for violence to happen. How about funding a chair in the non-narrative cinema of self-identified pansexuals?
What?
We also need to hire more deans to decide which Halloween costumes are appropriate.
8 deans should do it.
Is this still a coven of capitalism where evil money can acquire a patina of virtue?
Yes, that's in our charter.
But with an issue as heteropatriarchal as nuclear power, we'll have to hire multicultural empathizers, build a new safe space.
Not so fast. We insist on a chair of anti-nuclear studies and a nuclear-neutral curriculum pathway.
Absolutely, Teddy. We run all decisions past the squash team.
Also the fencing team, water polo, and Handsome Dan the mascot.
Release me, you hound.
Oh, yeah.
What's happened to this place?
Yeah.
This was the home of ruthless media disruptor Samuel F.B. Morse. Who's his successor? That fellow?
Fellow, that word is cisgender normative, okay? You're worse than Hitler!
Too late for flattery. I'm not giving this school a dime.
The last level that we can talk about in terms of Neo Secularization theories is micro level. And this is basically at the level of the individual. And basically, when neo-secularization theorists talk about micro-level secularization, what they're really concerned about is to what degree does religious belief affect people in their daily lives, how they live, how they choose to act, and these sorts of things. And what they will argue basically is that, we're secularizing in the sense that most people's daily decisions are not affected by religious concerns, right? So I'll just give the example here, of Roman Catholics, right? Most Roman Catholics, when they are planning out how many children they are going to have, broadly speaking, don't tend to worry too much about what the church has to say on birth control, right? There's going to be a small minority of people who are deeply concerned with what the church has to say about artificial contraception. Most of them, though, and here, the statistics back this up, it's about 90% of Catholic women who are sexually active have used some form of birth control. And so what that suggests at the end of the day is that basically the majority of people don't care that much about religious beliefs and how it affects their daily lives, right? That it doesn't really play a deep role in their decision making, right? So that they might be religious, they might even consider themselves religious, but they're making, their decisions more on secular grounds, maybe on economic grounds, than they are necessarily on religious grounds, right? So people will use birth control because they don't want to have 5 children, because they don't think they can afford 5 children, or because, the wife or the woman in the relationship wants to have a career. Rather than, the Catholic Church said in Humanae Vitae in 1965 that birth control is explicitly prohibited and objectively evil. So we see secularization on the level of the individual when people move more from, say, what does my religious kind of authority say, to, what do I think, or what is kind of best practices. And I mean, you can make the argument here that, this starts with the Protestant Reformation when people start interpreting the Bible themselves. That's an interesting kind of argument, I think. And maybe, the roots of secularization broadly are in Christianity itself, which I think, again, is not altogether unfounded and is kind of interesting. But, what I think we know is that most people today don't make their decisions based on much in terms of religious considerations. And that's micro-level secularization.
Okay, so I'm kind of tacking this on a little bit to neo-secularization, though it really belongs sort of in its own category. But there is this other kind of, I think, relatively minor theory when it comes to secularization that is called the self-limiting theory of secularization. Now, this initially is proposed by Stark and Bainbridge. Again, Stark basically has been kicking around since the 1960s, being a pain in everyone. He's passed away recently, but from like 1960 to like 2020, kicking around being a pain in everyone's butt in sociology of religion, never really taking the sacred cows of the discipline as writ, as holy words, as something that needed to be followed. And so he's proposed a lot of different positions, right? No secularization. In this case, the self-limiting theory of secularization. And you can see where this sort of fits in with market theory, right? And I talked a little bit about it when I talked about market theory as well. Basically, right, how this works is Stark and Bainbridge suggest that, basically as forms of religion become established, they sort of become more worldly, right? They shed their otherworldly character. So they become less about spirituality, faith. They become more about things like social welfare and service and taking care of the poor. And, all of those religious impulses may fade over time. And if you want a perfect example of this, right, you can look at the mainline Protestant churches in the United States and Canada, which in a lot of, things like the United Church or the Anglican Church or Episcopal Church in the US, which in a lot of ways have sort of lost a lot of their otherworldly character, right? They become much more about the here and now, and they become less about kind of the spiritual and connecting people with the spiritual, right? So then they start to, according to Stark and Bainbridge, lose their appeal. Why? Well, because according to Stark and Bainbridge, and this is always something that's sort of, for me, rung true. Other people I know disagree, but that what people want out of religion is religion, right? They want spirituality, faith, a connection with the otherworldly, not necessarily, a social welfare organization that runs schools and takes care of the poor. They want a connection with the higher power, and that's what they want. Those other things are secondary aspects of religion, but you need that primary aspect of religion. Okay, so what does this look like, right? Basically, older forms of religion, say the mainline Protestant churches, Roman Catholicism, lose their appeal and people leave, with poor people leaving first, right? For whatever reason, poor people leave at a much earlier rate or a much earlier time than richer people. And I mean, we can talk about this when we talk about the religious landscape too. One of the things that's really happened is the working class. Not that you're super educated. We'll talk about this later. It's strange and interesting. It's the working class and the poor that have left religion in North America and Europe first. The more educated you are, the more likely you are to attend religious services regularly. Okay, it's always the poor and the least educated that leave first, leaving richer people there, and basically it becomes a club for rich people. As membership declines, it provides less social capital, and the whole thing falls into crisis. Now, for Stark and Bainbridge, what happens then is you get a rush of religious innovators who come in and propose new forms of religious life that appeal to kind of the everyday working people, the people who still want that religious experience, but for whom these older forms of religion are no longer working, right? So you get, religious innovators, they propose new forms of religious life. We can talk about, like, say, Pentecostal movements that have done this, and, for the longest time, were fundamentally kind of working class at their core. And then this attracts, once you get religious innovators, then you get imitators, right? New religious movements, sects that come in and basically imitate what's going well and sort of create a groundswell. And according to Stark and Bainbridge, what happens is then you get an increase in religious sentiment. And there's some pretty good evidence for this. And particularly, I know I talked about it, previously, the Great Revivals, right? Basically, there were periods in the past, right? That famous poem, Dover Beach, where people saw the kind of decline and receding of faith, and then faith kind of came a charging back, right? So like in the 1950s and in the 1990s, we're looking at some of the most religious societies we'd ever seen, right, in terms of the West, right? In terms of regular attendance at religious services. I hit my table, I'm sorry. I'm moving my hands like a crazy person. You can't see because I'm recording myself with no camera on. But yeah, in the 1950s and 1990s, we had a very religious society in lots of ways, right? Lots of people going to church, really strong identification with religion. And so, we've had these sorts of ebbs and flows in religion in the past, like, and going back, as far as like the 18th, 19th centuries, right? And probably even before then, we've always had religious movements. Now, obviously, someone like Steve Bruce is going to say, no, religion is alien, right? That was when everybody shared and kind of knew things like the Bible, right? And Christian stories, or in other parts of the world, right? The Quran or whatever. People don't have that anymore. As there's been, more education, more forms of entertainment, more forms of knowledge, people don't have that as much. And so you won't get that up and down. But this is the theory. Self-limiting secularization says you're going to get a rebirth of religion once religion sort of has a moment of kind of fading from the public scene. Post-secularism, which to my mind, occasionally when I try to read the literature on post-secularism, is something to the equivalent of a migraine, where you hit your head against the wall until your head hurts, because I always find anything with the prefix post to be a little bit brain breaking. But I'll do my best here to sort of explain it. Really, the sort of proposer of an era of post-secularism is a European scholar by the name of Jürgen Habermas. Now, Habermas, is not a religious person by any stretch of the imagination, but what his basic contention is that we essentially have come through the era of secularization, and secularism has essentially won, right? That for all intents and purposes, and for the most part, religion has been pushed out of the public sphere and made something that is almost entirely private, right? That it no longer has the sort of cachet and control over people's lives that it did in the past. It is now almost entirely something that exists only in the private sphere, right? It's been pushed out of the halls of power, right? Religion really, except in a few places in the world, particularly if we're thinking about the West. If you went to the Middle East and India and Africa, totally different story. But, in the West especially, we've pushed religion out of the public sphere into the realm of the private, right? It's just you and your God in your house or your church or whatever. Okay, so what Habermas sort of suggests, however, is that this has left this sort of gap, right? Because, and here, what the quote at the top, right? Where he says, basically egalitarian universalism, which sprang from the idea of freedom and social solidarity, of an autonomous conduct of life and emancipation of the individual, moral conscience, human rights, and democracy, he thinks, is the direct heir of the Judaic ethic of justice. So, right, the idea of justice coming from Judaism and the Christian ethic of love. And basically that these legacies are substantially unchanged, right? Basically that we get the ideas of justice and love from Judaism and Christianity, or I think more properly it would be from Christianity through which flowed Judaism, right? Because Judaism or Christianity essentially started as a Jewish sect, right? So we get, a lot of our ethics, a lot of our understanding of the individual, of rights, and all these things from Judaism and Christianity. And, he says, to this day, there's no alternative to it, and that the secular and the humanist have basically held on to these same ideas without really having a source to justify them from, right? And we continue to draw on, in the kind of post-national and post-modern kind of era, we continue to draw on the substance of the Christian and Jewish heritage. There's no alternative to this. And in the end of this quote, everything else is just idle postmodern talk, sometimes translated, and I like the other translation better, but I'm told it's less accurate. Everything else is postmodern gibberish. Okay, so what does this kind of mean? Basically, that the values of secular societies, particularly in the West, are almost entirely drawn from Judaism and Christianity, right? And this is a case that's also made, say, by Tom Holland, who's a historian, in his book Dominion, which is a really interesting book, and I highly recommend it. Not necessarily something we're going to talk about here, but definitely I think worth a read. So, right, basically, what is post-secularism then? It's about trying to having pushed religion out into the private sphere and finding now that, some of the foundations of society in terms of those ethics is a little bit unstable without them, re-inviting religion back in some way that makes sense. And dealing with a couple of things. The fact that religion has not disappeared, right? That, like Stark says, religion ain't going nowhere. And you have to deal with it. And in some ways, you have revivalist faiths that are challenging to enter the public sphere. And how do we invite them in and sort of fold them into the kind of secular order of society, right? So certain forms of Christianity, you might think Pentecostalism being one of these, or Islam, right? Islam has gone through an enormous revival from about the 1980s forward, where Islam, went, from, in a lot of cases, a low intensity religion in lots of places to an incredibly high intensity religion, right? Where people are deeply committed to it in ways that potentially they weren't in the past, right? And if you look at accounts of Egypt prior to 1980, right, there was, Egyptian Muslims were in a lot of cases non-observant, right? And as they've encountered modernity, they've had this revivalist moment, which I think speaks to maybe, the self-limiting nature of secularization, perhaps. But post-secularism is really about trying to think through how do we invite religion back into a rationalist dialogue with society, particularly when we have the burden, and I'll say burden, of the Enlightenment, right? That said that religion was entirely irrational and had to be cast out into the darkness. How do we then invite religion back in, right? How do we make religion from which we do get values in ways that I think are fairly undeniable, right? Humanist ethics are this sort of post-World War. I'm being a little bit reductionist there, and I'm sorry. They're really this kind of post-Enlightenment sort of attempt to keep the values of Judaism and Christianity without the religious baggage. But are they sustainable? And so the post-secular is like, can we invite the religious back in and even say that we draw our values from there without necessarily being religious or necessarily bringing it back into the center of society, inviting it back into the discussion of society without, re-inviting it into the power position it once held. All right, so that's where we'll leave it for secularization. And obviously, right, this is going to have a lot of resonance when it comes to questions of youth, because, you know, young people today are living in a principally secular age. And this has affected them deeply because religion now has become sort of one choice amongst many. And particularly when we get to the cultural world of millennials and Gen Z, and then questions of parenting, we're going to see, right, that this reduction of religion to just a part of your identity, you know, whether it is secularization and the death of religion, or, you know, this Neo Secularization or post secularism, religion is now just one piece, right? It's not the full identity that people have. And so how is that going to then speak to how people adopt religion?